Thanks for joining us again, everyone. Some new faces today. Before I introduce our speaker today, I just want to say a little bit about how this last day is going to go. First, we have Sean, and David will speak next, and then we'll have lunch, and we'll come back at 2 to hear Brian Swim and Rick Tarnas. And then at 4, after a brief break, Becca Tarnas will speak. And then we have 45 minutes that I left open because I was hoping that we could have some discussion. And Talk, who was here with us the last 2 days, who hasn't arrived yet, but I'm sure he'll be back, suggested that we do a sort of Quaker-style meeting, which, as far as I understand, it's somewhat like Bohemian dialogue. Ronan can it help set the stage for that later, and I'm sure Talk will have something to say about it. But I just wanted to highlight Whitehead's discussion was that in Adventures of Ideas, he mentions this Quaker notion of concern, and this is even better than a citation, I just have it there, where he relates this notion of concern to the structure of experience, where in each moment of our subjective encounter with the world, we have a concern for the objects that we're experiencing around us, and we take them up with this sort of emotional or affective tone of concern. And because looking back at the weekend, the objective immortality of all the moments of experience that we shared over the past several days, and with an attitude of, I think, concern for the larger reason that we're here at this conference, I invite us all to just sit with those emotions and see what wants to arise. You know, we do have specific plans for publications and everything, but we can talk about that later. I want just to give space for more of less intellectual, logistical thinking, just more of an emotional space so that we can all share our concerns with each other as they've been activated throughout the course of this weekend. Okay, that said, I now have the great pleasure of introducing a good friend of mine, a teacher of mine, Sean Kelly. He's a professor at CIIS. That's the California Institute of Integral Studies, for those of you who haven't heard of it. He teaches in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program. Sean got his PhD in Religious Studies from the University of Ottawa. He's published several books, including Individuation and the Absolute, Hegel, Jung, and the Path Towards Wholeness, as well as more recently, Coming Home, Birth and Transformation of the Planetary Era. He's done some translation work, translating the French complexity theorist. I'm going to sit there with his book, Homeland Earth, a manifesto for a new millennium. New millennium. Sean is, his mind is, and his intellectual brilliance is unrivaled. Perhaps the only rival is his heart, his compassion, the way that he cares for his students and encourages all of us. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us, Sean, and I want to express my gratitude for your coming here, being in the track with us these last several days. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you. So, welcome, Sean.
Well, thank you, Matt. Initially when I heard about the conference, I said, I don't think I want to go to the conference. But I'm more grateful that you invited me, Matt, because it's helped me clarify, at least for now, a cluster of intuitions and ideas that I've been working with for many years. A lot of the background of the thinking, some of the thinking I want to share with you today, I have struggled with in my 2 books. But since then, I have been more and more drawn to think, feel, somehow embody and communicate and make real this notion of Gaia, which in some circles is a bad word, or just an unintelligible word, but in increasing numbers of circles and communities of concern, is a word that expresses something very interesting and crucial for our times, I believe. The word perhaps is not so important, but that's the word that I'm using. So this is really the focal point that I'm hoping of what we will be able to engage today. But I want to do it by means of what Brian Swim and our colleague Brian Swim in Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program, and his mentor and friend Thomas Berry called the Cosmogenetic principle. And the Cosmogenetic principle is actually three principles in one, which I've listed there. There's different ways of expressing it, but the simplest way is identity, difference, and communion. And it's a cosmogenetic principle in the sense that it can help us understand the deep nature and manifestation of the cosmos at all levels, from the origins as far back as we can see, the primal third and fourth, as Brian and Thomas described it, to our own times and at all scales, from the macro to the micro. Now, the other word here I have gives an indication of the worldview within which I'm situating my reading of the cosmogenetic principle. Some of you maybe, how many of you have heard the term cosmotheandric or cosmotheandric? Okay, the whole of the PCC, the resident PCCers here. Well, cosmotheandric, I know, I think it was coined by Raymond Panikar, although Eliade used it too, didn't he? Didn't he use cosmo? I thought he used cosmo, maybe cosmotheandric. But anyway, three terms, the theologian and ecumenical religious scholar Panikar coined this term to describe what you might be more familiar with from a Whiteheadian point of view as panentheism. So cosmotheandrism, or as I prefer, cosmotheanthropism, since andric is the male masculine gender, whereas anthropos should be taken as the human genus. Cosmotheanthropic is one version of a panentheistic worldview, but it makes clear that there are at least three dimensions that are integral to a panentheistic worldview, not just the theos, as we find in panentheism, but the pan is described as cosmos, theos, and anthropos, so these three terms which are integral to each other. Now, in Matt's talk, for those of you who are here, Matt mentioned this term cosmopolis, cosmopolitics, and cosmopolis, a term that has been proposed by Isabel Stengers and Bruno Latour, and is being forwarded in very creative and important ways by Matt himself in his ongoing work. So that is going to, it's related to a cosmotheanthropic worldview, cosmopolis, and it's also related to this term here that I have sort of coined, at least in my meaning, Gaiopolis. So I'm hoping we'll get to Gaiopolis as the concrete manifestation or instantiation of this cosmo and therefore geo-theanthropic worldview by means of the cosmogenetic principle. So maybe a few words about the cosmogenetic principle. Apparently, Brian told me yesterday that he heard from Thomas that Thomas got this principle from Aristotle, from metaphysics, which was news to me. I would have assumed he got it from his training in Thomistic theology, which of course is Aristotelian, but is grounded in the Trinity as well, in the doctrine of the Trinity. But it's actually a principle, if we dig down to what Jung might call the archetypal level of this threefold principle of identity, difference, and communion, we see it in all kinds of cultural streams. If we just confine ourselves to the axial streams of the world's great religious and philosophical traditions for a moment, and only to three of those for a moment, begin with the Taoist and Neo-Confucian cosmological vision. You may have seen, I'm sure you've all seen the diagram, the Tai Chi diagram, circle with black and white, with seeds of black and white in each of them, so on. So that I take that Tai Chi diagram as a symbol of the cosmogenetic principle, particularly in its third moment here, where we have both the principle of identity and difference in some kind of harmonious configuration. Now, in the Taoist and Neo-Confucian context, the first principle is called the Wuji, or the empty circle. Now, this Wuji is like a primal creative principle. It's empty, but it's also a plenum, out of which the yin and the yang, or difference, emerges. But, of course, the yin and the yang are always present on some kind of dialectical, dialogical relationship, hence the Tai Chi diagram. So this, to my mind, would be an example of what Bering Swim called the cosmogenetic principle, intuited in the Taoist and later Confucian and Neo-Confucian field strand of the tradition, even though there's no God per se in these traditions. We could go to the Buddhist tradition. There are many examples, but I would just point here to the Chinese, and in this case Japanese term Hongaku, or original enlightenment, strands of Buddhism in Japan, but that have their origins in China, Tiantai particularly, but also Huayan Buddhism, where the core insight of original enlightenment in these traditions has to do with the invitation to hold in one's awareness simultaneously an otherwise paradoxical relationship between emptiness and form, or between this primal, originary ground, which we can call identity. I'm not saying all these things are we can collapse them into each other, but I'm suggesting that there are deep resonances between them. Here's a little quote that from I think sort of Chi Yi. But in Japanese, the phrase that captures the insight is Ishin Sanya. So the three contemplations in one thought. So each dharma, so everything, every actual occasion, in one hidden. So each dharma, down to the smallest particle of dust, is simultaneously empty. Of course, it takes a while to really appreciate what is meant by empty. Just take it. Each dharma, down to the smallest particle of dust, is simultaneously empty. Provisionally existing. It's caught in the network of differences. And the middle, completely separated from the five thoughts. Now the middle, which is related to the whole idea of the middle way, the Yamaka, which is the root of the Mahayana tradition, out of which this original enlightenment tradition comes. This middle way is the challenge of really thinking and embodying this third moment, which is nothing other than the other two. It's not something separate, but it's the other two moments that we're able to take in. Okay. So my point here is that we can find this principle in cross-culturally in all of the great traditions. We find it in Greek philosophy. I won't go there, but we find it very worked out in Trinitarian theology. And I underline that because it's really in that line, that axial line, coming from the Christian hybridization of Greek philosophy and the Jewish mythos, that Trinitarian theology emerges, and that theology becomes the cultural, intellectual foundation of the Western mind, out of which modern science, the modern period, and so on, the planetary era is going to emerge. All right, let me go back here. So I'm pretty sure that this is the context that influenced, consciously or not, Thomas's insight into the cosmogenic principle. But what is it in the cosmos? All right, so principle of identity, if we take what we know in the standard model, at least of cosmology, we are drawn back to really an inscrutable origin, which we call singularity, but somehow out of which, in other words, there's a creative, originally ground principle of identity, which is self-referential, there's nothing outside of it, but from which all difference emerges. I think of this very concretely in terms of the field of elementary particles and so on. So there's a movement from the original identity to difference, and these differences, we can also think of them mathematically in terms of breaking the symmetry and so on. There's many ways of thinking of this moment of difference. But basically it's how we get something out of nothing. That nothing, again, is not simply nothing, that emptiness is simultaneously a plan. So this is what contemporary cosmology is telling us. But no sooner do we have this field of differentiated attention, then we have organization, and organization very, very soon into galaxies, relatively soon into planets and so on, that form a unified field. And there's cosmological, physical ways of describing the indissoluble unity between this seemingly infinite display of difference through field equations and so on. And this is the idea of community. So it's not just a moment by moment or a visionary primal flaring forth into an infinite multiplicity of difference. There is an integral organic unity that we call a universe, right, a cosmos, that can be described in terms of a principle of communion or community. So this is the universal cosmogenetic principle. Now and so we can see this at the level of the cosmos, we see it in the cell in terms of its principle of identity, the genome that's differentiated. Think of the universal principle of identity at the genomic level, the differences in terms of phenotypes, but there is no real separation between phenotype and genotype. It's through individual cells that the phenotype reproduces itself, which reproduces individual cells and so on. So there's a dynamic, recursive relationship between the universal and the particular at the genetic level, the cellular level. That's true of species, societies, and so on. In other words, this principle holds on the cosmic level, macrocosmically, all the way down, and all the way through levels. This is the cosmogenetic principle. I am more concerned with how it manifests sort of at the mesoscale, so not necessarily at I'm interested in cells and quantum physics, obviously. But I think given the state we're in right now, I'm more interested in seeing how this principle works out and how useful it might be for us to understand the concrete character of our moment, which I'm describing here in terms of the concrete universal. Now, the idea of the concrete universal I take from Hegel, but it's really present in Whitehead as well. If we had time, we could talk about the relationship between Hegel and Whitehead around the idea of the concrete universal, particularly Whitehead's idea of organism. I won't do that here. Okay. Here's how the three, I'm going to highlight these three manifestations of the cosmogenetic principle. Principle of identity, which is related to autopoiesis, self, creating, self-generating character of anything that lives, anything that has true being or existence. We see in the self-organizing dynamics of the planet. Ball of molten rock. No sooner does it cool enough, then basically the rock becomes alive, at least a very thin layer of life that miraculously emerges on the surface of that cooled rock. And as we know, that over geological time will eventually create the atmosphere, will keep the water in the oceans instead of hydrogen evaporating into space, will actually shape the structure and movement of plate tectonics. So life becomes a geological force, and the key regulating factor in the surface structure of the planet, as well as its atmosphere, chemical composition of the oceans, and so on. This is a self-organizing character of Gaia that James Lovelock has to highlight, but which is now taken for granted in what's called Earth System Sciences. Principle of difference or differentiation is most easily visible on Earth with the amazing diversification of life. We have the great gift and responsibility of finding ourselves in a geological period that corresponds to the maximum degree of biodiversity in the history of the planet. During the Cambrian explosion since, as far as we know, there's been I don't think the Earth had never seen before such a diversity of life on the planet. And we know that this diversity is key, this maximization of biodiversity is key to the self-organizing property of the Earth, certainly in terms of the atmosphere and the oceans and life itself, right? The diversity. In systems terms, there needs to be a requisite diversity for the system to keep sustaining itself. Otherwise, it tends to degrade towards an entropic state. The third principle is more ideal, certainly from a biological point of view or from a biogeochemical point of view, the interlinked systems of the geosphere, the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and the biosphere. There is a kind of community. There's an integral whole that has been established and maintains itself. But in our case, of course, human beings, the anthropos, this late arrival in the biotic community in terms of Earth history, in our own time, once again, has become a geological force. Now, with the so-called Anthropocene, if you accept that term, I know it's a contested term, but it does point to something very important. Whether we date the Anthropocene, as Matt said the other day, from 1945 with the atomic age, or from the beginning of the Planetary era or the Industrial Revolution, the fact remains that there is no part of the biosphere that doesn't bear the indelible imprint of human presence through radioactivity, through persistent organic pollutants, and so on, even just visibly from space. So Gaia, or the geosphere, is now a geanthroposphere. Gaia, in other words, is not just the coupled systems of the geosphere, which is hydrosphere, atmosphere, pedosphere, and biosphere. The anthroposphere, which has both a physical component of bodies or technology. Humans move more stuff on the planet than any other chemical cycling system right now. But there's also the mental component, the noosphere. So, but you take both the physical and the mental consciousness component as being the anthroposphere. The anthroposphere now is the defining factor in the fate of the biosphere as we've known it, as it has been stable over certainly through the Holocene, the last 10,000 years, but even throughout most of the Cenozoic, 65 million years. So we're seeing the self-organizing character of Gaia being illustrated by and negated by climate disruption. We're seeing it negated in other ways too, but this is the one that's getting the most attention, and rightfully so. So with the now with CO2 in the atmosphere just past 400 parts per billion, and the global, I don't need to repeat all of this, especially you there for Bill McKibben's plenary, climate disruption, we're looking at the increasing likelihood of runaway catastrophic climate disruption within 10, 20, 30 years, especially if the methane hydrates, if the so-called clot rate gun has indeed been fired from the Arctic. It's looking really, really grim. And if that happens, that is going to not only kill humans' ability to grow crops and possibly even breathe oxygen if the plankton continues to fall. We're at 30% of historic levels of plankton, the main source of oxygen in the oceans. Not only the death of the oceans in terms of the creatures that live, the larger creatures upon which other creatures depend for food. But the web of life itself could very well unravel. It doesn't mean there won't be bacteria and possibly cockroaches and maybe some other small animals and simple plants that can survive. But life, as not only we've always known it, but through a big part of the Cenozoic, the last 65 million years, is unraveling in our time. This is unparalleled. Not only have humans never seen it, but many other creatures as well. So biodiversity is being threatened by the current mass extinction of species, first one in 65 million years. So we could sit with it. Now, Earth community, as I was saying, is a fact. It always has been a fact. But if we ask ourselves the role of humans, anthropos, in that Earth community, we'd have to say that it's still just an ideal. It's not going to be a community, it's an empire, or it's a struggle between empires, depending on how you look at it. If you look at it in terms of capital and corporate dominance, oligarchical dominance, extractive industry, industrial growth society, it's a single empire that has its grips around the whole planet, regardless of nation state, regardless of language, regardless of culture. So that's an empire. It's also a form of apartheid, as we know. A lot about the 1% lately. But it's also a racial apartheid. It's north and south, the haves and have-nots, and so on. So it's a political, social, economic, spiritual state created by, maintained by humans that is keeping the majority of humans in a state of slavery 2.0, active oppression and suffering, and is threatening the very fabric of life itself. So this is the current state of Gaia. The irony, though, is that it's because of the life-killing, oppressive character of empire, ironically. It's because of that, in the late modern period, coupled as it is to a co-opted science and technology and the global spread of capital, that we are awakening to the fact that we are an Earth community, that we are an integral planet, where the human cannot be abstractly separated from the biosphere. So, two processes are going on simultaneously, as our friend and colleague Joanna Mason puts it. On the one hand, the fabric of life is unraveling, and in many places, the fabric of civilization. That's the great unraveling. On the other hand, there's a great turning happening, a great turning toward an ecological possibility of ecological civilization, toward sustainable communities, ways of living, sustainable technologies, and so on, and an awakening to the nature, not only of the cosmos, but of this concrete universal, of this singular individual Gaia, which is a complex whole, of which we are a part, and that part being having a particular responsibility of holding the consciousness of the whole, and trying to realize its innate potential as a reflection of the cosmic community to form an Earth community. How am I doing for time, Matt?
You've got 15 minutes.
Okay, I'll cut it in. So many, what might this ecological civilization look like? Well, if it's going to work, it clearly has to be consistent with the cosmogenetic principle. Otherwise, it's just in denial of its own cosmic and Gaian nature. But that principle can also help us think about what has to happen concretely. And I would point to the Global Commons movement and Earth Law as two examples. But we could also think of more specifically which kinds of political, ideological, economic avenues would be consistent with the cosmogenetic principle. Like communitarian anarchism versus an ecological Marxism, and so on. There are many potentials. They're all groping for a way of embodying a concrete universality, which respects the nature of life itself in a way that can sustain itself Now, I want us to have dollars. I'm just going to end there so we can talk.
Okay, thanks, Sean.
Yeah.
This term concrete universal is really helpful, I think. And I wanted to contrast it to the type of universality that I was criticizing in my talk on Friday, which is an abstract universality, which would be, this assumption of unity, like under with the notion of human rights, for example, which as an abstraction was meant to include everybody, but in concrete practice didn't, because there was a need for not just laws on the books, but for a new form of consciousness, a new form of life, a new ethics to go along with the law.
And
so
capital you mentioned too, the abstract universal capital.
Of capital, yeah, money as abstract value, but then there's another
Right,
example.
which is in fact owned by a small number of particulars.
Right.
Not only the amount of money, but the means to create and control the flow of money, for example.
Right. Yeah. So, and it's very Whiteheadian. I mean, obviously Hegelian, but also Whiteheadian to focus on the concreteness of a universal consciousness, way of life, ecological view. So I definitely appreciate you bringing that distinction, that there's another form of universality that we can move towards. So just, to clarify, what I was criticizing on Friday is not at all what you've been discussing with us today.
No, I when you were talking, I was like, oh, neat. I've seen the connections between your critique of abstract universality and its consistency with this approach. Not surprising. I mean, we tend to think.
Yeah.
So I teach high school kids, and I try to bring this stuff in, and oftentimes I tell them, I say, as a history teacher, I oftentimes feel like I'm a spoiler. They're kind of 15, 16, coming out of their childhood and adulthood, and I'm here telling you every day, the world is really a mess. Welcome to this literally hot mess. And yet I know it's so important. I also feel like there's a responsibility of truth telling in presenting this, and yet I also feel a responsibility to help give them strands of hope of within the midst of all this, where are action items and places of how catastrophe can also lead to possibility in this context, even though nobody has the answer in it, but where are some strands of from understanding this, how can I help my students kind of see a window of might not figure it all out, but these may be some trajectories that are worthy of your attention.
Well, two things. One, I'd really recommend, if you can fit it in, reading a book with your students by Joanna Macy, her most recent book called Active Hope, how to face the mess we're in without going crazy. And it's written at an accessible level and has some easy to do experiential exercises as well, where you can help your students start to take in the gravity of our moment, but empower them to do something creative. So I mean the good news is that we know what the problem is, and there are detailed plans on how to move forward. From the Earth Island Institute, or Earth Policy Institute, that's for Brown, Plan B, that constantly gets updated, just for example. We know what to do in terms of renewable energy, but will it happen? We don't know. Paul Hawken, in his book *Blessed Unrest*, is one indication of hope. It's a little old now. I don't know if he's still as hopeful as he was when he wrote it. But he lists these thousands upon thousands of organizations, NGOs, other organizations, all of which are devoted to alternatives to what's killing us. Most of these organizations don't know that each other exists, but there's a kind of, as he puts it, immune response happening on a planetary level. The largest social movement ever, he calls it, Blessed Unrest. So it is happening. Germanic Mason calls this the Great Turning. We can see it everywhere. We see it here. And it's radically uncertain. But yeah, for those of us who are called to be in this space, I think we do need to come to terms with the fact that it may be too late to avoid the worst. Or not the worst. It may be too late to avoid really, really bad things like mass extinction, collapse of civilizations, and so on. That may not be the worst. The worst might be that we lose our humanity, fall into generalized barbarism while that's happening. So, the best might be how do we cultivate and preserve our humanity as we go down. There's a planetary hospice movement that started that is devoted to accepting the fact that it's too late to avoid really, really bad things, and we need to start learning how to deal with it in a humane way. I don't know if that's going to happen, but for me personally, I just do what I can, and I have a whole sort of spiritual practice, and theology, and so theodicy, if you will, that I'm okay with that. Just like I need to be okay with the inevitability of my own personal death, which will happen at any moment. But how we help individuals and groups deal with that depends where they're coming, culturally, their age group, and so on. But we need people like us to talk about this so that we can facilitate other people's anxieties and gratitude. So yes, I know.
I would suggest that you might get the kids excited about the two things that Sean talked about, the Commons movement and the Earth Law, because there's a huge movement of recognizing that the water belongs to all of us, the air belongs to all of it, and to really push back against privatization. And to the Earth laws, like I think it's 120 countries now, unfortunately not Canada where I come from, and not the United States, but they have put into their constitution the right to clean air, to clean water, to etc. And the countries in South America, I think it was Ecuador was the first one, it's not even just rights of the human to have these things, it's the rights of Pachamama. I love Gaia, but Pachamama is even so much more visceral or something. And so the rights of Pachamama to be undisturbed, recognizing exactly what you're saying, that the earth is self-organizing and that she should not be interrupted in her processes. So, it wouldn't take long to just do a little bit of research. Actually, I could give you some links if you want to talk to me later about where to go for that information. I write about it. So kids get really excited about that because, it is a hot mess that we're in, right? And so they need to have something that they can work towards because you're going to be in despair unless you get up there and, like Joanna Macy says, you roll up your sleeves and you get to work and you do it in community.
Yeah, I want to thank you. What you brought up with teaching young ones, high school or whatever. So I teach freshmen at right across the Bay Bridge in Berkeley, and we don't, as John Cobb has been pointing out, higher education and maybe high school education ain't doing what needs to be done. And I taught freshman seminar with Paul Hawkins' Blessed Unrest, but I've kind of abandoned it because I don't know where the action is. So collaborating, it sounds like you, I don't know how CIS is doing, but it sounds like you're having some educational success. And, so we need
we're
to...
at the forefront. We are the flagship institution.
We
need
need
watching online.
we need to talk to each other. I want to learn from you what you're doing and to bring it to our students.
Likewise,
Also.
and I live in Berkeley, so we'll talk.
Yeah, I teach philosophy and religions at Quest College, and so it's introductory. It's mostly high school, just out of high school, and it's very challenging because you can't do like really experiential out of the classroom things, and so I use Sophie's World and Passions of the Western Mind to supplement it. But I feel when I get to the end of the course, when I've taken them through what modernity has done to us, and I get to the end of the course, I want to give them something to go out with. I give them the epilogue to Passions, but along the line of this, is it I need something that's really condensed and easy to get across in the last session or two. Is there anything available, visual or that could help them? I showed the Awakening Universe in the last session, but and I feel like they get it. They know we're in trouble, but I don't feel like I have anything that I can give them to take away at such a restricted level that I teach. And world religion's the same way. I end with Awakening the Universe and
What's Dwayne Elkin's more recent book that's very accessible? I don't know what it's called.
He was at your conference.
Right.
Yeah, that's a good little book that sort of covers highlights from the world's religious traditions and science and so on, and it sums up a lot of stuff. I can't remember what it's called.
That's okay. I think I got it.
Yeah.
About it, yeah.
And Joanne's book, Actable, I'd recommend.
Is it Voluntary Simplicity? Is that
No.
That's his old one, which was
There's a
good
new-
too.
It's the newest
The new
one.
one.
Where are we going?
2 or 3 years.
Well, I can't remember the problem is that, they're great books and I can extract things from them and give it to students, but I say, is there any, visual media or...
Well, there's Journey of the Universe, right? For the larger cosmological perspective.
That doesn't give them. This is great because it comes right out of what I've been teaching.
Oh, thank you.
But I don't know how to
Yeah.
move them out of it. I
Well,
feel.
we should talk. I'm not. We can talk after and see if we can put our heads together. And
Yeah, I
find
just think if we're supposed to produce things out of this, one of the things might be something that we can give students in just the last session or two or whatever it takes, or weave it through. That's just really quickly accessible. I hate to do that, but I can't ask them to read these books and talk about them. We just don't have that kind of time.
Yeah, and unfortunately, my writing is not that accessible. I'm trying to make it more accessible.
Well, I haven't. When you first started, I'm going.
Yeah.
But then it's like, oh, I know all this stuff. It's like I was just adding together and thought, this is really good, but how do we?
Yeah, for written material, it's not as clear.
As long as this has taken a turn towards solutions, I'll mention the Pachamama Alliance.
Yeah.
Right, which does the Awakening Universe, which I
And
show.
there is a youth version, Generation Waking Up,
Oh.
that is much more active and interactive, engaging them in a definition of their own generational boundaries and who are we as a generation. And
This stuff by Pachamama?
well, it's an affiliate. I can give you that information
I love it.
afterward. And there are little groups I know in Los Angeles working on making that happen in Los Angeles, for example.
So it's of course, this transition viewpoint and director transition town. The thing is, they're just popping up everywhere. There's websites, organizations, and this is a hopeful sign. So people, they're kind of groping, and it's not clear which one or ones will become the most efficient framework to help coordinate and catalyze the largest number of people.
Let me just finish with one thing, that for adults, Pachamama Alliance has now anointed Citizens Climate Lobby and moved to men as the tipping point kinds of organizations to put your efforts in.
Great.
So, yeah, I would love to start talking about metaphysics and stuff, but we
Yeah,
better
sure.
wrap it up and we can continue that discussion at lunch. So thank you, Sean.
Yeah.